Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to Learning About Learning. Uh, this is a project of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm Jonathan Krasner. I'm a core faculty member at the Mandel Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this ongoing series of conversations with scholars in Jewish education. We create this series as a way to share scholarship in the field of Jewish education with a broad audience of educators and Jewish leaders. At the Mandel Center, we're committed to developing and promoting scholarship in Jewish education, especially scholarship on teaching and learning in Jewish education, in order to make a deep and lasting difference on the lives of learners and the vibrancy of the Jewish community. Today's session and our other events help us to serve our mission by getting important ideas out into the world. We encourage you to take a look at our Mandel Center events page to see the rest of our events, both future events as well as past events. And we're delighted to have so many of you joining with us live, and we hope that we'll be able to take some of your questions as we go along. So feel free to post those questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're also recording today's session, and we'll make the recording available afterwards on our website for those who won't be able to join us today. Our guest is Yael Silverstein. Yael is a PhD candidate in social organizational psychology at Columbia University Teachers College, and Yael has an MS in applied statistics and a MBA, I should say, from Columbia Business School. And she was a 2024-25 Mandel Doctoral Fellow. We're here to talk about your new article, which you co-authored with Karen Block, entitled Making the Invisible Visible, a taxonomy of contemporary anti-Semitic experiences on college campuses. And that appeared recently in the Journal of Jewish Education. Yael, welcome. Good to see you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Happy to be here.
Great. Let's start with the backstory for this article. How did you decide that you and Karen wanted to write it?
Great question. So, the origin of this article is pretty inseparable from a larger project that Karen and I have been working on, which is developing a scale called the Contemporary Anti-Semitic Experiences Scale, what we call the CASE, which is going to be the first validated tool that measures anti-Semitism from the target's perspective. That is, capturing what Jewish people actually experience rather than only assessing the attitudes of perpetrators, people who hold anti-Semitic beliefs or attitudes. So, in building the case, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more later, we grounded it in the microaggression framework, which is the same literature used to study experiences of racial minorities, LGBTQ individuals, people with disabilities. So, it gave us the scale and architecture that really already captured a full spectrum of anti-Semitic experience from really overt to more subtle, everyday forms of identity-based hostility. As part of the project of scale development, we collect samples, samples of people, of groups to understand whether or not we got it right and as part of the scale development. And so we were collecting our first campus sample. It was the summer of 2024. So just locating that moment in time, it wasn't even a year after October 7th. And it was right after many campuses, including Columbia, where I was at the time, were experiencing encampments that had pretty genuinely virulent anti-Semitism directed at college students, faculty, and staff. And while we were collecting the sample, I had a colleague, a professor at a smaller school in New York, who said to me, my provost keeps saying we don't have an anti-Semitism problem on campus. And what was that provost's evidence? Well, they didn't have any protests. So for me, that was a bit of an aha moment. And it made me realize that for people who are not experiencing anti-Semitism, some of these less overt incidents are genuinely often invisible to them. It's not on their radar, it's not reaching them. And unless something rose to the level of, let's say, a hate crime on campus, it wasn't being reported or making it into an official account of campus life. And so that really drove us to turn the scale development paper, which we were still in the midst of working on, into the taxonomy paper that we published in the Journal of Jewish Education, really to publish a framework that institutions could use to recognize, name, respond to anti-Semitic experiences across the spectrum, not just the ones that make the news. And I should say, while I'm presenting here, that what we're talking about today is a sample from on campus. We subsequently, over the following year and a half, did collect data from Jews across the United States, including a representative sample. And so, what we're going to talk about today, the everyday experiences of anti-Semitism as it pertains to what we wrote about on campus, are pretty closely mirrored overall with the experiences that Jews over 18 are having across the US. So that's just something for us to hold in mind when I'm talking about what was happening on campuses.
Great. So why don't we get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of the methodology? So you created this taxonomy, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the taxonomy itself in a few minutes, but you also wanted to test drive it, right? So tell us a little bit about the methodology.
Sure. So the campus sample, as I mentioned, was designed to test a very preliminary version of this scale, which had, at the time, it had too many items, which is part of scale development. You have more items and you narrow it down to the ones that are most representative of the phenomenon that you're studying. And so we had these five categories: overt assault, micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidations, and collective delegitimization that we kind of hypothesized based on the literature. And we needed to refine the scale really to cut down the number of items. So we were testing in this campus sample, and the data collection really served kind of for psychometric refinement of the scale, but it also really became the empirical grounding of this taxonomy paper. And so we collected a sample, which was of 250 plus Jewish faculty, staff, graduate students, and undergraduate students. It ended up being from across 85 North American universities, mostly in the US, but some in Canada as well, with a real range of as diverse as a Jewish community on college campuses, but different campuses, large, small, research, liberal arts, state schools, the gamut. The data we collected were from May to October 2024. So really a moment in time if we kind of remember back to that. And I should just note one of the things is just a scale like this is not a policy instrument. So it doesn't define what is or is not anti-Semitism. Scales in this kind of literature don't do that for any sort of group. What it does, and what we were doing in measuring this in our method, is capturing a range of experiences that can be perceived as identity-based harm. And what we are able to do is it lets us examine relationships with measurable outcomes. So we, in this sample, as part of our methodology, we're examining the relationship between these types of experiences and psychological distress, behavioral changes, social harm, exclusion. We also asked a bunch of demographic questions to be able to understand, just, do these patterns differ by subgroup? Religiosity, age, views on Zionism, for example.
Great. And I'm interested, you mentioned before that this is a scale that you adapted, based on microaggressions that was used or has been used with racial minorities, with the LGBTQ community. What kind of, if any, what kind of challenges did you encounter when you adapted it to, a religio-ethnic group like the Jewish community?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one we spent a lot of time, many, many months thinking about and working on. So, as you said, in the social psychology field, there are dozens of these scales that measure types of harm, experience a range, right, from subtle to more overt, less intended to more intended, for all these different groups, including some religious groups. There are scales that measure harm against Muslim Americans, Black Americans, women, intersectional identities. So there's a pretty robust literature, and Jews and Jewish social identity were entirely absent from this framework. And so, in adapting any one of these microaggression frameworks, there are two levels that generally we can be looking at. The first is general identity-based microaggressions. These are microaggressions that could be shared across any marginalized group. So, for example, exclusion based on your identity, right? That could happen to any group, fill in the blank, being excluded from whatever it is based on your social identity. Then, and so those we had a pretty good sense of what those are from the literature and, again, thought, could these apply in what ways? The second piece really involves understanding the specific stereotypes and stereotypic experiences that are unique to each group and the bias content of the group. So let me give an example. Um, Being followed around in a store is a microaggression that is experienced by Black Americans because it maps onto the content of a stereotype, which is an
Hmm.
assumption of criminality, according to the
Right.
literature. That's not a microaggression that happens, for example, to the elderly or to pregnant people, who also have their own content of stereotype about their groups, but
Right.
it's specific to the content of the stereotype. And so the form of a lot of these microaggressions follows the content of the bias. So the second layer, we had to draw on decades of historical scholarship about Jews and anti-Semitism and the stereotype about Jews and the content. And some of it had parallel where we adjusted, and some of it had no parallel. So let me give two examples.
Yeah, great.
Something that had similarity, but not quite the same. Something we find in the literature um, that is particularly salient for microaggressions against, for example, Asian Americans is this idea of not a true citizen, sometimes called alien in one's own land. Like you're not a
Hmm.
true American. There was a meme, several years back of like, where are you really from? Someone asking, where are you, as if you're not really American. And so in the decades and thousands of years of content about Jewish stereotypes, we know that there is a trope of dual loyalty. That is similar. It has a second aspect to it, another aspect of not just you're not American, you're foreign, but something about a traitor. It's
Hmm.
disloyal. And so we were able to take that category and adapt it because it wasn't a far adaptation. There was an analog. Something that had really no analog, conspiracy myths. So much of anti-Semitism is rooted in these libels or conspiracy myths that cannot be disproven, that are
Right.
unfalsifiable. For Jews, it is often about power, domination. That doesn't have a lot of parallels for other groups. And so we had to really think about where does that fit in? How do we incorporate it? So what we were able to do is, use the standard microaggression dimensions that exist and these taxonomies that exist. We did add two specific things. So the first was overt harm. Now, a lot of microaggression scales kind of stop at micro assault, which is explicit. So, for example, like incitement to violence. Um, but one of the things that the literature says about Jews is that groups that are perceived as highly competent and threatening tend to elicit not just resentment, but active aggression. Jews have historically fit that profile. And so we made sure to include at that end of the spectrum overt harm, physical threats, verbal assault, direct assault, harassment. You only have to look to the FBI statistics to know how true, unfortunately, that is for Jews. And the second is a collective delegitimization, which is an adaptation of micro-invalidations. Micro-invalidations are invalidating someone's racial reality, for example, gaslighting about anti-Semitism on a kind of interpersonal basis. But anti-Semitism has historically functioned differently from many other forms of prejudice in that Jews often occupy a symbolic role in society, that of the archetypal other. Um, and so there's this targeted logic in which the Jewish collective existence itself is rendered as threatening or illegitimate. Empirical work has kind of confirmed that this takes separable but related forms in the minds of anti-Semites, right? Classical kind of anti-Semitism of dehumanizing tropes, conspiracy, and that when what is often called anti-Zionism organized around the delegitimization of Jewish people and statehood. And so we had to capture that in some way as a distinct factor. It's a group level micro invalidation where these libels and animus is directed as at kind of the state of Israel as a proxy for a Jewish collective.
Great. So just so that people who are listening can kind of get a concrete understanding of the scale. So let me throw a couple of examples out at you and tell me like where they fit on the scale.
Sure.
So let's say that uh, somebody in the chat suggested that they were Hillel is hosting a Shabbat dinner, and they put out a something online, and somebody responds with like "Free Palestine," like response online. Like, how would you classify that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this gets into a lot of intent versus harm, right? The intent versus impact debate of what is harmful versus what is not. Um, and I will say Free Palestine is not an item in our scale for a number of reasons. Um, It's a tricky one, and this is why. So this is a little bit part of the intent versus impact debate, which is very real. It is grappled with across all minority groups. Um, critics can argue, critics of scales like these that measure the target experience argue that what one person experiences is harmful, another may not have intended that way. That is very real. Some other things, though, that the literature shows us, and this is specifically from something called the minority stress model, provides some grounding for this, which is that persistent exposure to prejudice, regardless of intent, can function as a chronic stressor. There can be cumulative impact on the person experiencing it, and that it's measurable, and it often matters quite a bit. And we know it kind of empirically that targets, people who experience identity-based harm, reliably recognize microaggressions. We often can see them when others maybe cannot or feel them. And it can frequently predict psychological distress. So again, this is where this kind of an instrument is validated for a lot of other groups, and we wanted one for the Jewish experiences. And, thinking about this idea of kind of, the critique of Israel in some ways, if we want to get there, our taxonomy, I should just say, it doesn't touch legitimate political critique, which again, we could have, reasonable minds could have reasonable arguments as to whether Free Palestine on its own or in a particular context is or is not intended to be experienced as, but we don't touch legitimate political critique. And not because we avoid the question, it's just not how microaggression frameworks work, right? As I said, it's theoretically possible that someone might experience legitimate critique of Israel as personally harmful, just as someone might experience a critique of US policy or a politician as an affront to their American identity.
Right.
Um, that kind of experience doesn't make it into the microaggression framework for any group. It's built around really identity-based harm, not political agreement. And I will say, when we started, we had 117 items that we generated. Through this process of many years of refinement, there are 26 that are kind of the most representative of what's in that category. And so, again, things like libel, some of the libels we do measure, but none of our items ask about a critique of a state or a government. It's just not what we're measuring.
Right. So just quickly, because I want to make sure that we have time to talk about what you actually found. Like, would an internet troll is that considered a microaggression? Is that considered a microassault? Like, how do you classify
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, it depends. That's a great question. And I will say, actually, in our very first iteration, we had all of these online incidents. And then we realized that the online is pretty similar to the offline. And so we made it location agnostic, but we did look at it at one point. And I will say, we in a forthcoming chapter, we do show that online is so much more frequent and the harm associated is greater because of that frequency and the cumulativeness, but it depends on the content. So things that are more explicit. incitements to violence, justification of violence against Jews. Those were pretty explicit, right?
Hmm.
Verbal harassment is what we call overt assault. It is direct, it is explicit, it is the most overt assault. Micro assault are things like, as I said, the explicit calls for violence against a group, justification. We saw a lot of that after October 7th. It is not unambiguous. It is harmful, but it might not be a hate crime. And we've seen,
Right.
again, a lot of kind of debate about that. It's harmful speech. We're not saying it's not free speech. It could be,
Yeah.
but it's harmful speech. Things like conspiracy myths would fall into the category of micro insults, right? Oh, well, Jews, control the banking industry, or Jews, have a conspiracy to rule the world. Those would fall into what we call micro insults. And again, the word micro does not mean micro impact. It
Uh-huh.
just means that they're every day. So it's a bit of a misnomer, perhaps, for some people hearing it. It just means that they're everyday experiences. These micro
Right.
insults, micro invalidations are denial of racial reality. Oh, what you experienced isn't really anti-Semitism. Double standards and how things are treated for anti-Semitism or Jews vis-a-vis other groups. And then, of course, the collective delegitimization, accusations that Jews are not indigenous to the land of
Right.
Israel, which is historically inaccurate and serves as a libel around settler colonialism.
Right.
So just those are just some very kind of concrete examples. I would absolutely refer people to the link that has the paper in the Journal of Jewish
Absolutely.
Education because it has the taxonomy and very concrete examples of items in each if people are interested in learning more.
Right. So I'm sure that everybody is at this point at the edge of their seats and they want to know what you found out, Yael. So tell us, you did all of you took this on the road, you did this sample survey and like tell us what you found out.
Sure. I'm saying it's smiling because it's nice to be in conversation with you, Jonathan, but I will say the findings were depressing. They were validating because they mirrored many of our own experiences, but they were depressing and they continue to be. And our findings serve really two audiences. So we found that the rates of Jewish students, faculty, and staff on college campuses were incredibly high. Nearly 99% experienced at least one anti-Semitic experience in the 12 months preceding, with the highest category being this invalidation. And so what do I want people to kind of take away from this? For Jews experiencing anti-Semitism, I think this taxonomy really gives us language of what has been both dismissed and unnamed. Right? Researchers have shown that microaggressions often go unchallenged because they are, quote, disguised in ways that provide cover for their expression and the belief that they're harmless. And so without language, it's really hard to push back on a perpetrator, on an institution, on the self-doubt. And as I said, the validation piece is critical here. 98.4% of our sample experienced microinvalidations, Jewish identity being, or perceptions of anti-Semitism being dismissed, denied, distorted. And so, and we showed in our paper, it has real harm, consequential harm, race-based traumatic stress symptom harm. And for everyone else reading this paper, for bystanders, for administrators, institutional leaders, again, one central reason discrimination often goes unchallenged is that modern bias can be invisible to those who are not targeted. And we're hoping that this taxonomy, the takeaway, what we want people to know from this taxonomy is that should challenge it, should give our non-Jewish colleagues and leaders a framework to recognize, one, things that they might not encounter themselves, and two, to see that the stakes are real, significant correlations between anti-Semitic experiences in depression, anger, hypervigilance, physical stress symptoms across every category. And so, again, we know from research across other groups, there's a significant toll of subtle discrimination in these everyday experiences that are comparable to overt discrimination. Our findings confirm this holds for anti-Semitism. They are not minor slights. They accumulate and they have real impact. And I think that those are the main takeaways from what we found.
So tell me, I know that since you wrote this article, that you've not only looked at universities, but you've looked at other settings as well. But I am wondering, since there has been a lot written about universities, what do you think the takeaways are for a university administration that might be trying in a genuine way to address the anti-Semitism on their campus?
Sure. And I really do hope and have a lot of goodwill towards a lot of administrators who are trying to make their campuses more inclusive for everyone. The first, measure it properly. You have to move beyond hate crime reporting. We have to use validated campus climate instruments that capture the full range of experience. You cannot address what you do not see, and institutions are not seeing most of this. Second is to train people to recognize it. Again, the most common form of our data is micro-invalidation, this dismissal and gaslighting. It is happening in administrative offices charged with the well-beings of students. So a taxonomy like this would give people a framework to understand the range of what can be harmful. Even if it should be allowed as free speech, it can still cause harm. And that's really important. And then the third is really to invest in broader inclusion and belonging. In our paper, we show that anti-Semitic experiences are associated with lower institutional commitment, but that social acceptance is associated with higher commitment. So
Hmm.
an inclusive campus is a moral imperative, and our data suggests that it also may be structurally protective.
Great, great. What do you do about the subjective element of all of this? So, you're asking people about how they experience things. Some people might just have a tougher skin than other people do, and some people may be more suspicious of the intentions of other people, whereas some people tend to be, I don't know, more forgiving or maybe just kind of like see the best in everybody. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's true for any group as well, right? And there are a number of factors that impact how any one of us experiences and interprets those experiences based on our own histories, um, our own reading, our own knowledge. So even just as an example, um, there are these conspiracy kind of tweets on the dark web and online that colleagues have kind of surfaced that talk about, um, the Viennese painter was right, or Soros take a shower, which pretty much anyone who is familiar with some of these tropes in history would agree. All of these raiders would agree is objectively anti-Semitic. I was explaining this to a Jewish friend maybe a year or so ago, and she had never heard of some of these terms. And so if she saw this, even though it might be objectively anti-Semitic, she wouldn't experience that as harmful. And so, again, these scales are not meant to say something is or isn't or should not be allowed. Much of this is free speech, right?
Right.
These are not policy documents. These are documents to widen the aperture of how we understand anti-Semitism. We have long understood it from the attitudes and beliefs of perpetrators. We also need to understand what things Jews experience and how. And so your question was, well, we can't say just Jews. It's not monolithic. People experience things differently. And as I said, that's true of any group. And the way in which we think about this is first we measure very large samples. This was a smaller sample for a number of reasons. Our subsequent samples have been in the thousands. They have been nationally representative, pegged to the pew to look at all sorts of denominations, visibility of Jewish identity, of Jewish identity, political beliefs, ages, and of course, there's variance and variation. And what scales like this can do is be able to articulate with a little bit more precision for which groups certain things are true or not, right? For anti-Zionist Jews, XYZ versus for Zionist Jews. And so it gives us language to speak with precision and understand better the types of harm for whom and how, which we're hoping will give us better insights into interventions for people who experience harm.
I think you just encapsulated why this is so important, and why it matters. So, believe it or not, we're at half past the hour, and I told you it would fly by, and it did.
Right, bye bye. Yes.
And I just want to thank you, first of all, Yael, for doing this, for sharing your research. I know that so many people will be interested in this. I hope they read the article, as you said. I hope they take the taxonomy seriously, and I wish you a lot of luck as you continue this work. Since this is the last event of the season, I also want to thank Liz Donalfo, the Events and Communications Manager and Senior Department Coordinator at the Mandel Center, whose behind the scenes work makes all of this possible. I want to thank the audience, all of you, for joining us. And I want to encourage you all to check out the Mandel Center events page to see our videos of our prior events. Head over to our podcast page and subscribe to our podcast feed. And finally, for those of you that celebrate, I want to wish you a happy Passover, a happy Easter, or whatever your celebration might be. Take care, everybody. Have a good day.